I'm Janet LaRue Buck. I was born in Alberta. Should I tell something about my age and my life? I was born in Alberta in 1935, and I was born in the house where I live now. My grandparents were a doctor and a nurse, and they had the first hospital in Benzie County in this house. And so I was fortunate enough to be born here, delivered by my grandparents. And my grandparents delivered many, many babies in their lifetime. Over 3,500 babies in Benzie County and Leola County in their lifetime. And they practiced medicine. My grandmother retired when she was 73. My grandfather never retired. He just was still practicing when he died, and he was 77. And my grandmother continued to live in this house until she was 96. And so then the house was sold, and 30 years later we were able to buy it back and restore it. So I'm back home again after having lived in a lot of places around the world. After high school, I graduated from Frankfurt High School. Then I went to Michigan State University and studied to be a teacher. And I spent my winter term of my junior year at Michigan State in Mexico City, studying Spanish and Mexican culture and art and architecture. Then after I graduated from college, I went to San Diego, California to teach. And there I met my husband, who was a young naval officer. And he was just about to leave the Navy. He had been sent to the Navy. He had had an NROTC scholarship. He went to Northwestern University, and so he had an NROTC scholarship there. Then after 4 years that he owed the Navy, he decided he didn't want to make a career of it. So he went to New York, and after my first year of teaching, I went also to the East Coast and taught in Greenwich, Connecticut for a couple of years. We were married, and our first child was born there. And then in 1962, my husband was working for a firm in New York City while I was teaching in Connecticut. And then in 1962, his company sent us to Paris, France. And we lived in Paris for a couple of years, and then we moved to Switzerland. And we lived in Switzerland for 3 years. And then we were back in the States. We lived in the upstate New York. We had a house that was built in 1803, and it was quite a nice old house. And we lived there for 5 years until we were back in Paris for another 5 years. And then back again in New York State. And then my husband joined the diplomatic corps, the U.S. diplomatic corps. And so our first assignment was Lagos, Nigeria. We spent 2 years in Lagos, and then we went to the United Arab Emirates and spent some time in Abu Dhabi. Then we went to Morocco and lived 4 years in Casablanca. And then we were sent to Taiwan and lived in Taipei for a couple of years. And then my parents were getting old, and we wanted to be back in the States close to them. So his final job with the Foreign Service was actually a domestic job, and we lived in Seattle for a couple of years. He was the district director for the state of Washington. Then we decided to retire back in northern Michigan, which was my home. He was from Iowa. And so we came back here. We had a house on Crystal Lake, and we lived there for a number of years. And then the opportunity to buy back my grandparents' home came up, and so we took it. And we worked on restoring this house for 2 or 3 years, and then we finally moved here. And we've been back. We've been in this house, and actually the house across from us, which shares the village block with that, we used to own that house too, and we sold it a few years ago. But we lived there for a while and ran a bed and breakfast here for 7 years. And finally, when I was 80, I decided it was time to retire. So I did. So I've been retired for almost 6 years now. And so that's the story, sort of my life.
So you grew up in Benzie County. What was it like growing up here in a small town?
Well, it was quite a different place than it is now. In many ways, it was the same, but I grew up in Alberta. I grew up just a couple blocks from this house, but my mother died when I was only 3 years old. So my father and my little brother, who was only a year and a half when she died, and I moved back into this house with my grandparents, and we stayed here for about 2.5 years until my father remarried, and he married someone actually he'd known in high school. And she was a very nice stepmother, so I was fortunate. But when we were kids, we could go any place. I started going over the Alberta hills to Lake Michigan with my friends when I was 6 years old by myself. We went by ourselves. Nobody seemed to worry about us, and I know that children would be out playing in the field or something. There used to be a big field behind us. Now there are houses on it. And if one of them would get injured, they would just come to the door and tell my grandparents that they'd got this kind of injury, and so my grandparents would have them come in the house and they would patch them up. And then if they were little, my grandfather would say, "Now here's a nickel. Go buy yourself an ice cream cone," because you could buy an ice cream cone for a nickel in those days. Or if they were bigger, especially if they were boys, he would say, "Now go down to the swamp and get me a turtle so that my wife can make me some turtle soup." And because they were worried that they didn't have any money to pay the doctor. But the doctor didn't care. He was happy to just take care of people in those days. They didn't care whether you always paid your fees. And when my grandfather died, in 1949, there were about $100,000 in outstanding debt to him. Now, $100,000 in those days was a lot of money, a lot more than it is today. It's still a fair chunk of change, but in those days it was a lot of money. Nobody locked their doors. If you wanted to borrow something from a neighbor, you just walked into their house and borrowed a cup of sugar, and even if they weren't home, and then when you'd been to the store, you could just go and replace it. Of course, if you saw them, you told them you'd done this, but they didn't care. They did the same to you. As they always said, you always knew where the car keys were. They were in the car. Where else would they be? We had pretty much free range of ourselves. People didn't worry about us. We didn't worry about strangers picking us up or anything like that. All those things that we worry about today. Let's see, what would I like to tell? Well, we spent, all the kids from the time they were about 6 years old would have a summer job. Picking cherries was a big summer job for little kids. And I remember when I was 6 years old, I got this summer job working for this cherry orchard, which was owned by Thomas's, and they also owned a grocery store here. And I went, and the first day, and it was hot, and it was hard work, and I remember that we made 50 cents a lug, which was 2 big pails, and a lug is, you probably know, is a wooden box, a rectangular wooden box that holds 2 pails of cherries. Well, it took me all day to pick one whole lug, and I didn't like that job at all. And when I got home that day, I announced at the dinner table that I had quit my job. And my father said, "You're not going to quit the very first job that you've ever had. Now you're going to go back tomorrow and you're going to continue picking cherries until the season is over." And so I did. And I was pretty proud of myself by the end of that season, because I think I made $15 or $20 altogether, and I was able to go out and buy some of my own school clothes, and I was very proud of myself. Now, the other jobs that we had are babysitting, and I can remember I had one particular job of babysitting where it didn't matter how long I stayed to babysit. Whether I stayed an hour or whether I stayed 6 hours, I always got $1. So that was just the going rate, I guess, at that time. Then when we got to be 14, we could get a real job in a restaurant in the summertime. And the first job I had was a soda jerk for Didrikson's drugstore in Frankfurt. And I shared that job with another girl. And I remember that we made $12 a week, and we worked 6 days a week. We each worked 6 hours a day, and we made $12 a week. Another job that I had later was at Chimney Corners Resort, which still exists, and that was a really nice job because Molly and Jim Rogers were such nice people, and there were such interesting people who came there. And I remember that there we made $22 a week plus tips, and we worked from 7 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon, and from 5 in the evening until the kitchen was all cleaned up, which might have been midnight by the time, depending on how many people we had. So those were just some of the things about growing up here. Sliding in the winter, swimming in the summer, of course, the things that people like to do still.
So you talked about your mother a little bit. Could you talk a little bit more about your parents and what did they do, like as a profession?
My own mother, who died when I was very young, was a school teacher. She had graduated from Frankfurt High School. Her parents had come from Norway. They came from Norway at the beginning of the 20th century. And they had 3 sons who were born in Norway, and then they had 5 daughters who were born in the United States. And my mother was the second from the youngest, and she was born in 1908. And she graduated from Frankfurt High School in 1927. And she went for a year to County Normal, the County Normal was right next to the old Frankfurt School, and which is of course in the same location as the elementary school is now. And so she went there for a year, and then she got a job teaching. She had an older sister who was a teacher in Pontiac, Michigan. So she went down to Pontiac, and I'm not sure she taught in Pontiac, but she taught near there for a couple of years. And by that time, she and my dad were courting, and so she decided to come back up here and got a job teaching in Alberta at the Alberta school. She was teaching kindergarten. And I remember going to a Valentine's party with her shortly before she died. She took me to a Valentine's party at the school. My dad was the finance person, like the controller at the Alberta Packing Company for most of his life. He also owned a gas station with another man for 2 or 3 years on the M22 in Alberta, and but most of his life he worked for the Alberta Packing Company, which is in the same location where the Cabbage Shed is now, the Cabbage Shed restaurant and the marina. And the smokestack, actually, from the Alberta Packing Company is still there. But the Cabbage Shed, the reason that it was called that is that they did store cabbages there for a short time. Mostly they stored cherries and apple juice. Alberta Packing Company was famous for its apple keg apple juice and its cherry hoe canned cherries, and they canned both sour and sweet cherries. And but my dad laughed when they named the restaurant the Cabbage Shed. He said they really only stored cabbages here for a very short time, but anyway, it makes a good name.
Do you have any siblings, and what are their names?
My only real sibling was my brother Frank, and he was 2 years younger than I, and sadly he passed away. Let's see, it's about 4 years ago now. So he was 79 when he died, or almost 79. And his training was in library science, and he was a librarian in Grand Rapids and in some other places around the state during his lifetime. And there are 3 children. One of his sons is an artist in Grand Rapids. He has a daughter whose specialty is computers, but she's married to a man from Traverse City, but they live near Peoria, Illinois, because he works for a company in that region, and he's an engineer, and they have 2 daughters. My brother Frank's other son, Peter, worked for quite a few years in the aeroscience industry, and then he made enough money. He's not married, and he made enough money so he could retire, and he wanted to become I'm trying to think, the Border Patrol. He wanted to join the Border Patrol, so he joined the Border Patrol for a while, but I think he got fed up with some of their policies, so he finally retired, and he's just been kind of enjoying himself now. So, the daughters of one of my father's sons, his eldest son, has 2 sons. One is a professor at the University of Washington, and the other one is a nurse in Chicago. And then the 2 daughters which would be the 2 granddaughters of my brother, are one is working with missionaries in Asia, but right now, because of the pandemic, she has had to be back in the States. And the other one is married to a man who's studying to be a missionary, and they have 2 little children, and they live in the Detroit area.
You talked a little bit about your grandparents and being able to come here like after you were playing. So
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
You were talking about your grandparents earlier, and your grandpa being able to help the kids out in the field.
Yes.
What were your grandparents like?
Well, my grandmother, LaRue, I had 3 grandparents who came from Norway. My mother's parents, Grandma and Grandpa Peterson, and my father's mother, my grandmother LaRue, she was born in a town, near a village called Surnadal, which is in the northern part of Norway between Trondheim and Kristiansund, which is on the North Sea in the north. And she grew up, and she talked about skiing to school, and in the summertime they had a hut. She lived on a farm. They had a hut up in the mountains where she would take the cattle and the goats, mostly goats, I think, in the summertime. And she would, because she was the eldest child, she would go up and stay in this little hut and be the goat herd, kind of like Heidi. It was kind of a Heidi type existence, except that this was in Norway. And she would spend the summer there, and then she would come back down and, of course, go back to school. She had several siblings. There were 8 children in all, one of whom was born in the States, but the others were all born in Norway. And when she was 16 years old, she had already finished high school. And she came with her family to America. In fact, I have a little booklet. Let's see what I was going to show it to you, but I'll find it later. I thought I had it right here, but they, and so she, by the time she got here, her parents were well-to-do farmers in Norway, but they had to spend all of their money to bring their big family to the United States. And they had been encouraged by another man by the name of, he was from Alberta, and I'll think of his name in a minute. But anyway, they had been encouraged, her parents had been encouraged to come here by this man. And so they finally came after he'd been trying to talk them into it for 20 years, because he had come to Alberta much earlier in the 1860s. They came in 1888. And first of all, they worked in a lumber camp. My great-grandfather worked with the lumbermen, and my great-grandmother cooked for the lumbermen in the lumber camp. But then they amassed enough money to buy a farm, and so they bought a farm off Grace Road outside of Alberta, well, which was at that time still South Frankfurt. And they had this farm, a 160-acre farm, where they raised cherries and apples. They had cattle, and they lived on that farm for the rest of their lives. And one of their sons took over the farming when they got to be elderly. But I remember both of them. They were both in their 90s when they died. And so I was fortunate enough to know my great-grandparents. And my grandmother's other siblings, my grandmother went, when she got here from Norway, she had to go to work because they needed money to help support the family at that time. So she went to work for a lumber baron by the name of Lawrence Crane. And if you go to the Benzie Historical Museum, you'll see there's a whole room dedicated to the lumber barons, and especially to Lawrence Crane. And there's a big sign that says Lawrence or Crane Lumber Company. And he was here in South Frankfurt, which is now Alberta, and he was said to have had the largest lumber mill in the world at that time, in the 1880s and 1890s. He died in 1899, I believe, and he was not that old a man, but he was an Irishman, and he had a large family, and he built the house where I am right now, that I'm living in. And he built the other house, which is on this village block. and that is where he and his family lived. And then when his eldest son was grown and about to get married, he built this house as a honeymoon cottage for his eldest son and his bride. So they were a very interesting family. There's a very historic family for this area. My grandmother went to work for them as their chambermaid and seamstress when she was 16 years old. And she worked for them for a couple of years, well, from 1888 until 1892, for 4 years, nearly 4 years. And she had a younger sister who had, she had a lame hip. And so they didn't know whether she had had polio or whether she'd had tuberculosis of the hip. But my grandmother took her on the train to Ann Arbor, to the University of Michigan Hospital, to see if she could be treated there. And while she was there, this was 1892, she heard that they were starting a nurses' training school. So she signed up for this nurses' training school. And so she came back with her sister after she'd been treated and submitted her resignation to Lawrence Crane and his wife, Annetta, saying that she was going to go to nurses training at the University of Michigan. So she went to nurses training. She was in the first real nurses training class at the University of Michigan. And at that time, it was only a 2-year course. So she graduated in 1894. And I have her diploma, which is in another room in the house, which I'll show you in a little while. And my grandfather, LaRue, was born in Empire, Michigan. And his parents, his father was the first white settler on the Leelanau Peninsula, and his name was John LaRue. And he and his second wife, he had a first wife, and she had died when she was quite young and left him with 2 young children. And so he took these children back to New York State, to Lockport, New York, to live with his wife's sister. And while he was there, we assume anyway that while he was there, he met my great-grandmother, Sophia LaCour LaRue. And they were married, and he brought her out to the wilds of northern Michigan in 1851. If you ever go over to the Empire Historical Museum, you will see there's a first settlers room, and there are photographs of John and Sophia, which I donated to the museum, and they had restored and reframed. And there also is my grandmother's rocking chair, or great-grandmother's rocking chair that she brought from New York State, and her tea service. And it's a silver tea service, which is on permanent loan from me. But she brought that out to northern Michigan, and I guess maybe she thought she was going to serve the Native Americans with it, because there wasn't really anyone else around except for a couple of other white families at that time. And she also is reputed to have been the first librarian in Northwest Michigan. And there, I have never seen one of her books, but I have heard people say that they have seen books with her stamp in them that she would loan to people. Now, I don't have one, unfortunately, but she was a librarian, and she and my great-grandfather ran a hotel in Empire. They really founded the village of Empire, although it didn't become incorporated until the 1890s. They went to live there in the 1850s. and they ran this hotel, and there were many lumberjacks who stayed in this hotel. And my grandmother really ruled with an iron fist, so I'm told, because she had to, because these lumberjacks could be pretty wild. And and she was, in later life, she was nearly blind, but she still managed to handle these lumberjacks. And my great grandfather had a lot of different positions, political positions, and he was a postmaster for a while, and he did a lot of different things. My grandfather LaRue was his youngest child. His oldest child, Aunt Mary, great Aunt Mary, was born in 1854 in Northport, and she is said to have been the first white child born in Northwest Michigan. And she became an artist, and when she was about 10 years old, her parents sent her back to New York State to live with her mother's family there. My great-great-grandfather, my great-grandmother's father, had been an engineer on the Erie Canal, and he had come from further east in the United States to Lockport, New York, and Royalton, New York, in 1823 to be an engineer on the Erie Canal. And anyway, my great-grandmother had a lot of siblings, and my great Aunt Mary went back to Lockport and stayed with them, went to school there because there wasn't a proper school here for her yet then. And then she taught art in the Lockport schools, and later she married a man and moved to Rochester, New York. I have a painting which she did, which is this painting right here. So she was quite a good artist, and I have some copies of some of the other paintings that she did. The other siblings, my grandfather's other siblings, all grew up and lived in Michigan, married and lived in Michigan, except for one brother who never married and died when he was only about 50 years old, or maybe not even that, probably in his early 40s. My grandfather decided that he wanted to study medicine, and so by this time his eldest sister Mary had married this man, and they were living in Rochester, New York, which is also the place where the Kodak photography company was. And my grandfather went there probably because his sister was living there, and studied with a man kind of as an apprentice, with a physician as an apprentice. And he studied with him for at least a year, and then he went to New York City and studied at Bellevue Hospital for a couple of years. And while he was there, he and some of the other medical students decided they wanted to go to England and see if they could find a good place to study medicine there. So they took a ship to England and looked around, but they didn't find what they were looking for. So they came back, and then my grandfather decided to go to the University of Virginia. So he went to medical school at the University of Virginia, and he completed his medical training, but just before he was to take his exams in 1895, there was an illness in his family back in Michigan, and so he was called home to take care of of somebody, and I'm not sure who it was. And so then he didn't go back to take his exams. I visited the University of Virginia and seen his transcripts, and he had all the credits he needed and everything. So he started to practice medicine in my great-grandparents' hotel in Empire. And then he met my grandmother, who had finished nurses training and come back to this area. They met at a 4th of July picnic. And then they met again. A couple of times they met. So they married in 1897. And then my grandmother joined my grandfather's practice in my great-grandparents' hotel in Empire. And they practiced medicine there together from 1897 until 1902. During this time, they had their first child, my Uncle Charlie, and then they went to Johannesburg, Michigan. And I think they not only practiced medicine, but I think my grandfather had another kind of a job there too, but I'm not quite sure about that. And while they were there, my great-grandmother, Sophia, died. My great-grandfather had already died in 1897 at the age of 83, which was quite a remarkable age for those times. My great-grandmother died while my grandparents were in Johannesburg, and it was in February, and the snow was piled high, and I was told, my grandmother told me that my grandfather walked on snowshoes all the way from Johannesburg, Michigan to Empire to attend her funeral, and all the way back as well. Then they decided in 1904, they had twin boys, and they both died. One died just a couple days after his birth, the other when he was only 3 months old. And they'd had a lot of sadness in that year with the death of my great-grandmother and of their twin boys. And my grandfather decided to go back and take some additional medical training. So he and my grandmother left with their young son Charles to go to Grand Rapids. And at that time there was a college called Grand Rapids Medical College. And they went there, and my grandfather spent 2 more years studying medicine there and graduated in 1906. My grandmother did some nursing. Of course, she had to take care of their young son, and she ran a grocery store. My grandfather had been left by his parents, some property in Empire, and he also sold that so that he could complete his medical training. Then they came back to this area, and they came to Alberta, which at that time was still South Frankfort. They came to South Frankfort in 1906 and started practicing medicine. And when they first arrived, they lived in the old Thomas Store building in the one of the apartments above, which is now the beauty salon down here. But that was the old Thomas Store building, and they also ran their medical practice, out of that building. Then they had children born in my Uncle Ensley born in 1907, my Aunt Alice born in 1909, and my father born in 1911. And they moved to another house. They didn't have room for their bigger family then. They moved to a house on Lincoln Avenue in Alberta. I have a picture of it. And then in 1918, they decided to buy this house where I am telling you the story now. And they bought this house in January of 1918. And I think one of the reasons that they were able to buy it for such a good price is that there'd been a murder in this house. And there was the man who owned this house before them. The house was sold in 1906 to a man by the name of August Natzel. And August was a very successful real estate man. He also had a livery, so he rented out horses and sold horses, and people could rent a horse and buggy from him, a horse and carriage from him. And he was very successful. He had a large family, but he had a man who worked for him, and his name was Swagger Anderson. And Swagger, am I telling too much?
No, you're fine. Okay. I'm so interested right now.
Swagger Anderson had a family, but he liked his liquor. He really liked alcohol. And August Naetzel, this was before Prohibition, but August Naetzel kept his alcohol in the basement. And of course, as I said, nobody ever locked their doors in those days. And even when I was growing up, which was quite a few years later, they didn't lock their doors. And so Swagger would sometimes come in at night, and he'd go down the basement and help himself to August Naetzel's alcohol. And so August he knew this was going on, and Swagger worked for him, and he knew that this was happening, and he was very angry. So he let it be known all over town that he was going to get Swagger Anderson. And nobody knew how he was going to get him or anything like that, but they just knew that that's what August kept saying. Well, this was 1917 by the time this was happening. August's first wife had died. He had several children by his first wife. He had a second wife, and he had just one child by that wife, and at the time he was living here. And so one Saturday night, and it's important to remember the date of this because this was the 23rd of June, 1917, and August and his wife had gone to bed upstairs in the front bedroom, which was the master bedroom. It was my grandparents' master bedroom as well. And suddenly he heard somebody coming in the door downstairs in the kitchen. So he had a gun by his bed, and he grabbed his gun and ran down the stairs, and by this time Swagger Anderson was on his way down the basement stairs, and he shot him dead. And so then, it was a Saturday night, people had cars that backfired in those days. There weren't very many cars, but there were a few. So the neighbors didn't think anything of it. It was Saturday night, cars were backfiring, or maybe people were just hooping it up, they didn't know. And so August ran upstairs to get he had a teenage son. He needed some help getting Swagger's body out of the basement and into a wheelbarrow. And so they got his body out of a basement window and into a wheelbarrow, and they covered it with burlap. And they wheeled it down Washington Avenue to Betsy Bay. And people didn't think anything of it because August had a business down there, and they just thought he was taking something down to his business. They had no idea that there was a body under that burlap in the wheelbarrow. So he dumped the body in Betsy Bay, came back home. Now this was Saturday night, the 23rd of June. So for a whole week, nobody knew what had happened to Swagger Anderson. His wife said he just disappeared off the face of the earth, and nobody could find him. Nobody had heard anything at all about him. And so the next Saturday night, there were some men out fishing on Betsy Bay, and suddenly they saw this body floating in front of their boat. But the fish were really biting, and they were very reluctant to do anything about the body, but they thought, well, they better. So they hauled the body over to the old Frontenac Hotel dock. By this time, of course, the Frontenac Hotel had burned. It burned in 1912, I believe. And so they just tied the body to the dock and went back to their fishing because they wanted to take advantage of these fish that were really biting. And so the next morning they went to the coroner and told them, the coroner, that they had found this body and that it was tied up to the Frontenac dock. So the coroner went down and looked, and of course, lo and behold, it was Swagger Anderson's body. And so pretty soon the news got out that Swagger Anderson had been found dead in Betsy Bay. And as men often do, and sometimes still do today, they would gather in little restaurants or cafes for coffee in the morning. And August Naetzel was here on the Alberta, the South Frankfort Main Street, having coffee with a bunch of other men. And of course, the subject of Swagger Anderson probably came up, but suddenly somebody ran into the restaurant and they said, Swagger Anderson's body has risen to the top of Betsy Bay. And August, before he thought about what he was saying, he said, and I put all that iron on him. And so before that day was over, August was in the Benzie County Jail. And that was the 1st of July. And my grandmother LaRue said at the time, in 1917, the 1st of July was the last of August. So that is a true story, and I have the whole trial, which I found in the Benzie County Courthouse, and so it's quite fascinating reading. And what happened to August Naetzel was he was convicted and sent to Jackson Prison, and August had his father-in-law had agreed to try to sell some of his properties to raise money for his trial. And he bought this house from August just so he could have the money for his trial, but he lived in Boyne City and he didn't want this house, so he sold it to my grandparents in January of 1918. And so that is how they got the house.
That's crazy. Like the whole iron thing, that's like an episode of my dad watches westerns all the time.
Gunsmoke?
Yes, exactly like Gunsmoke.
Right.
That's an exact Gunsmoke episode.
Well, this is a true story. So anyway, it is a story that I've told before, and in fact, the monthly newsletter of the Benzie Historical Society has this story in it. Quite a few years ago, when I was on the board, I told the story and wrote it in the Historical Society. But there are many people who have not heard it, of course. So.
So earlier you talked about Frankfort High School.
I'm sorry?
Earlier you talked about going to Frankfort for high school.
Right.
What was it like growing up? I know this is like a long leap from what we were just talking about. But.
Well, you mean in the high school?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we had, of course, we had sports. I played in the band. I played clarinet in the band. We marched on the same athletic field that they have today. The bleachers have been changed, but they were in the same place. But the high school wasn't there. It was just the athletic field. And it was called Lockhart Field, which it still is today. And we had Friday night dances after the game, after the games usually, and then of course we had them, I think, all winter long. We had Friday night dances, and of course there was basketball and baseball, and we went to, because I was in the band, I got to go to most of the games, away games as well, because we would go and play at the away games. We had the only language that was offered in high school at the time that I was there was Latin, and so you took 2 years of Latin. There were you could decide, and I don't know how it is now in the high schools, but in those days you could take a general course, a secretarial course, or a business course, or a college preparatory course, and so most of my friends and I were in the college preparatory course, and so we wanted to take as much language as we could, and so most of us took 2 years of Latin, 4 years of English. I took I took algebra, geometry, chemistry, physics, but there was no trigonometry. There were no advanced. There was nothing beyond physics as far as sciences were concerned. We had school plays. We had one wonderful teacher. Her name was Irene Wire, and she was a very good friend of Gwen Frosticks. And of course, everybody knows who Gwen Frostic was. And when Gwen first built her place out on the river road, Irene was going to go and live with her there. She was not married, as Gwen wasn't either, and she was going to go and live with her, but they had some kind of a falling out, and so Irene never went to live with her. But I kept in touch with Irene Wire until she died. Even when we were living in Paris, she came to visit us once in Paris, and but she went back to her own hometown in Ohio, I think, or Indiana, to live after she left Frankfurt High School. Now, another person I should mention as one of my teachers was Florence Bixby. Florence Bixby was my 6th grade teacher, and she will be 100 years old next summer. She is still living, and she has survived COVID this winter, I've heard. I haven't talked to her since, because she went to a special recovery place. She was in the hospital, but she is quite a remarkable woman. She was after she taught, and she taught in Alberta for many, many years. And after she taught, she became the curator of the Benzie Historical Museum, and still, until she came down with COVID, sometime during the winter, she was still volunteering at the Benzie Historical Society, and she still works from home. Now, I have to see now what's happening to her, but she was my 6th grade teacher in Alberta. I have some of the teachers. I had my math and science teacher's name was Frank Malekas in Frankfurt High School, and he just passed away a few years ago, but he wrote a very interesting book about his World War II experiences, which I have. But he was a young man when I had him as a teacher at Frankfurt High School in the 1940s, late 40s. Well, we had a lot of fun as high school kids. We did, we had beach parties. We did things that we weren't supposed to do, that our parents told us never to do, like climb on the icebergs. And my husband and I drove down just yesterday to see if there were any icebergs, but they're paltry compared to some of the icebergs we used to have when we were kids. As a kid here in Alberta, I spent a lot of time playing on the Alberta hills. and we would build tree houses, and we had so much fun as kids. We didn't have television. We had radio. We would listen to radio programs we would listen to the hit parade on Saturday night, and we would listen to Phil Harris, and we would listen to Jack Benny and Fibber McGee and Molly, and that was our entertainment. But we would all huddle around the radio, and it was just a lot of fun. Now, the Garden Theater, of course, has been there since 1925 in Frankfurt, and what we usually did from the time we were pretty young children was we went to the matinee every Saturday afternoon at 3 o'clock. And then, of course, as we got older, we went to the movies in the evenings, too, sometimes. And there were scary movies like Frankenstein, and there were movies like Lassie Come Home and National Velvet with Elizabeth Taylor when she was 12 years old, and Gone with the Wind. I remember when the first time I saw Gone with the Wind, we all took our lunches with us. We took a lunch with us because it was such a long movie, and there was an intermission, and we were afraid we might get hungry. So we went to see Gone with the Wind. I remember seeing The Wizard of Oz at the Garden Theater in 1939 when I was 4 years old. We saw so many wonderful things there, and one of really memorable time I recall was we were there on a Sunday afternoon, and they announced that the World War II had ended. It was a false announcement. We all ran out of the theater yelling at the top of our lungs. I wasn't 10 years old yet, but I was so excited. Now, during the Second World War, we did a lot of things to help the war effort as kids. We collected scrap metal. We collected newspapers. We went picking milkweed pods, which they used the down from for the vests for the pilots who were piloting during the Second World War as life vests. I remember, although I wasn't that old, I remember the day that the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. I was here in this house with my grandparents. It was a Sunday morning, and Sunday afternoon, I'm sorry. And my grandfather was resting in the formal parlor there. And he was the most kind and benevolent of grandfathers. He never raised his voice to me. But there was an old-fashioned radio. I have one just like it, which is in a different place now, but between the two windows in the formal dining room or living room, and there was an announcer by the name of Gabriel Heater. And Gabriel Heater always had bad news, always. But he would say, "There's good news today," or "There's good news tonight." And then, of course, it was all bad news. But the worst news that I ever heard him announce was that Pearl Harbor had been bombed by the Japanese. And my grandfather, who never, ever raised his voice to me, said, "Be quiet!" I was doing a little dance for him, showing him something I'd learned at school or something, and he said, "Be quiet!" And I said, "Oh my goodness, what have I done? What have I done?" But it was that, I knew it was something terrible that had happened. I didn't quite understand what it was, but I knew it was something terrible because he never would have spoken to me that way. So I remember that well, and I remember all the headlines, and I would read the newspapers a lot because everybody was interested in what was going on, and everybody was into the war effort. It's not like the wars we have now where some of us hardly even know what's going on. Everybody knew what was going on. And my father was an air raid warden, and he had a little billy club. That was his defense in case the Nazis arrived here. He had this little billy club, and I still have it. And I can't tell you where it is right now, but I know I have it. I think it's up in the attic. But it was quite a time at that time. And I was still going to the Alberta school then, but you asked me about the Frankfurt school. Did I tell you enough? Or?
Yeah, that's good. I'm going to ask you a question because we've already went over most of it.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
I'm just going to ask you a question. Yet again, it's a little bit jumped because we've gone over a lot already.
Okay.
Your grandfather was very popular and had a lot of people attend his funeral. Oh, wait, I had a question before that. Hold on.
You're talking about my grandfather, LaRue.
Yes.
Dr. LaRue, yeah.
Could you tell me about his practice during the Spanish flu?
Mm-hmm. I also have a little medical museum, which maybe I should show you. It's in the carriage house. It's cold out there, and the medical museum has not been cleaned because, you know, it's winter, and I usually have people coming to see it in the summertime, but last summer, because of COVID, I didn't. So it hasn't been properly cleaned for a long time, but I still want to show it to you. But my grandfather and my grandmother had their practice in this house, and they had their office in the front parlor, and they had, sometimes this was the consultation room there, this other formal parlor, and then they also had a bench out in the hallway, and then there were sliding doors. The doors have now just opened, but they were sliding doors, and I've had people tell me that they used to sit out on that bench waiting for those sliding doors to open and being called into the office to be examined by my grandparents. And but my grandfather had an examination couch. I have a similar one in the medical museum, but it isn't the same one, but I have a similar one. He had his examination chair, and I have it out actually I have the one that belonged to Dr. Covey, who was a contemporary of his who practiced in honor. But I don't know what happened to the one that my grandfather had, but this one is exactly like it. And Dr. Covey also graduated in the same class at Grand Rapids Medical College as my grandfather did. So they were contemporaries, and they were good friends, and they helped each other out a lot. My grandmother, people used to come here, and of course they had at least 2 rooms upstairs, which were hospital bedrooms, and one of them is particularly that I remember, where most of the babies were born. Sometimes, if a woman was having a hard time with her pregnancy, she would come, and I remember one woman came and stayed for 3 months before her baby was born. And my grandmother prepared her meals, carried them upstairs to her, took care of her, but she did this with everybody. And I don't know whether you, Leah, have seen a book, but there's a book called A Nurse Remembers, which was written by Ina Kraft Jackson. Do you know who she was? Has anybody mentioned her to you?
I don't think so.
She was considered the dean of nurses in Frankfurt for many years, but my grandmother was considered the dean of nurses for the state of Michigan for many years, because she was the oldest graduate of the University of Michigan Nurses Training School, and but Ina was my father's age. They were they graduated from high school together, and she became a nurse, and she started a little hospital in her parents' home in the 1930s after she finished her nurses training. and it was called Anna Markham, and it was on Forest Avenue. All the old timers knew about Anna Markham. I had my tonsils taken out at the Anna Markham Hospital when I was 15 years old. But she worked some with my grandparents as well, and she wanted to write a history of the medical profession in Benzie County. And so she wrote this book, and I'll show you the book. It's I have several copies of it, but and the first first two chapters are about my grandparents and this house and their medical hospital here. And but my grandparents worked 24/7. I don't ever remember a Thanksgiving dinner when we weren't interrupted by a phone call that somebody had a turkey bone stuck in their throat or something. That we used to have a big table and all the family here. My grandfather would have to go out on a house call someplace. They often went out to homes to deliver babies. And there's one story which is quite amusing, although at the time I don't think my grandmother was terribly amused by it. Grandpa and Grandma had this old 1937 Ford coupe car, and they were going out, and they were going up Stratton Hill. Do you know where Stratton Hill is outside of Alberta? They were going up Stratton Hill. It was in the middle of the winter, and there was a terrible snowstorm, and that car just would not make it up the hill. And my grandfather said to my grandmother, "Now, Ellen, you get out and push, and I'll wait for you at the top of the hill." So she got out, and she pushed, and away he went, but he forgot to wait for her at the top of the hill. And so there she was, stuck in a snowstorm, and fortunately they knew everybody, and so she was able to find shelter in somebody's home. But my grandfather got to the place where they were delivering the baby, and they said, when he got there, they said, "Where's Ellen?" And he said, "Oh, she's at the top of the hill on Stratton Hill." So anyway, he delivered the baby, and he went back, and he picked her up, and they came home. But I sometimes, when I was a young child, I used to go with my grandfather on house calls. And I also, this cabinet right here, they used to keep their medications in. They dispensed all of their own pharmaceuticals. And they would come in to the post office, and then I would often be sent down to the post office, even when I was a very young child, to pick up their mail. And I was running drugs at the age of 6, but it was their legal medication that they were, and then I would sometimes help my grandfather fill the pill bottles. And he had something called a little pink pill for hypochondriacs. And so, he would give those little pink pills to people who weren't really sick but thought they were. And so he would let me fill those bottles for him. And then sometimes I would go on house calls with him, and I can remember him prescribing these little pink pills to some people along the way. And I remember he would have to go and cut people's bunions and toenails and things like that. And but he made house calls all the time, and so did my grandmother. And during the Spanish flu, which of course has been very much in the news because of the COVID pandemic now, they bought this house in 1918, and the Spanish flu had already started to rage by the spring of 1918, but it didn't really come to this area until the fall and winter of that year. And I have been told, and my grandmother also told me, because she lived for 20 years, more than my grandfather did, so I was in my 30s when she died, and she told me a lot of things. And she said that during the Spanish flu pandemic, my grandfather would be out in his horse and carriage or horse and sleigh, because they didn't have a car yet then in 1918, going to take care of patients all over Benzie and Leelanau counties. He still had a lot of patients in Leelanau County because he'd had a practice there early on in Empire. And he would be in his horse and carriage or horse and sleigh for 2 weeks at a time, never sleeping in a bed, while he was out on the road taking care of all these people who were sick from the Spanish flu. And my grandmother, who had three young children, she stayed here and took care of the patients who came to the door. So that was very early on when they had this house that the Spanish flu came. They were very dedicated people. There was no such thing as really specializing in those days. My grandfather was a general practitioner, but he was also a surgeon. He had upstairs on the landing area, there was a little room, and that was where his operating table was. And that is also where they put the newborn babies. But I have the operating table. It's in my medical museum out in the carriage house. And so he performed operations there, and he had a little cabinet that you opened up, and it had a kind of a rolling shelf unit. And that's where he kept his medical instruments. And so it was quite an interesting practice that they had, but they were always on call, and they were always available. There was no, you just, once in a while, if my grandfather felt he just needed to have a little bit of respite for a little while, he loved to fish, and he would take his fishing creel and his bamboo pole and go out to the end of either the Alberta or the Frankfurt breakwater, and he would sit out there and he'd put his hat down so we would hope nobody would recognize him, but everybody knew who he was. Trying to get away from it all for just a little while, but he was a very dedicated doctor, and my grandmother was very dedicated too. And even after he died, there were many people who came to this house to have my grandmother help them. And not only that, but there had been so many people, especially during the Depression of the 1930s, when people had no money, who couldn't pay my grandparents. And that was why there was so much money outstanding on their books when my grandfather died. But people, and of course my grandparents never tried to collect that money. You know, there were so many poor people in those days. And so people would bring my grandmother things. They would either come and offer to help her with something like mowing the lawn or doing some kind of chores for her or something, or they would bring her bushels of apples and peaches and pears and all kinds of food. And she was living here by herself. She couldn't eat all of that, but she canned a lot of it and put it in the basement. There's a big cement shelf down there, which I can still remember was full of canned fruits and vegetables. And because you couldn't move through the kitchen, there were all these huge bushels of food that she had to take care of. And so it was, you know, but people were very appreciative of all that they had done to help people. And I can remember my grandfather, when he would go out on his house calls, And he always brought something home, depending on the season. And he always had his fishing creel and fishing pole in the car, too, just in case he passed by a place where there might be some fish fighting. But during the elderberry season, he would bring home elderberries. Do you know what elderberries are?
Yes, I do.
Mm-hmm. He would bring home, and he would put them out on the porch, and my brother and I would have to, they're small and they stain your fingers, but we would have to de-stem them all, and then my grandmother would make elderberry pie, and sometimes my grandfather made elderberry wine. And then during the morel mushroom season, he would bring huge masses of morel mushrooms. And I always wish I had gone with him and found out where those secret places were that he found all those wonderful morel mushrooms.
It's a gold mine.
And my grandmother would fry them up, and oh my, they were good. And of course she made turtle soup. Her recipe for turtle soup and for many other things that she made are in this cookbook, because I contributed to them when they did this cookbook. But it was, my grandfather also liked to make dandelion wine. And then in the basement, he always had a barrel on tap with homemade root beer. So we could go down and help ourselves to homemade root beer whenever we felt like it. And there was a summer house. It was a lattice octagonal house. I'll show you a picture of it out here in the yard, and that's where the boys would bring the turtles and leave them until my grandmother could make turtle soup. So
I couldn't imagine eating turtle soup. I've never eaten a turtle
it's
before.
delicious. Have you ever had it?
No, I haven't. So earlier you mentioned that when you were in high school you chose to go on the college path. How did you know, or what made you decide that you were going to college?
Oh, well, I never thought that I wouldn't go to college. I don't know, I used to be teased sometimes because I used to say, I'm not going to get married until I have a car, a house, and money in the bank. Well, of course, I didn't have any of those things when I was married. But no, I never thought that I wouldn't go to college. Most of my mother's siblings went to college. My father went to radio school, and he had one. His brother Ensley went to mortuary school. But there's another story that I probably should tell. Am I taking too much time?
Oh, no. Well, we can take a break, in the middle, because this is going to be a while, so we can take a mini break and come back.
Well, when my father was in high school, there was this. My father was a really big man. I'm not a very big person, but he was 6'2" and weighed 250 pounds. He wasn't fat, but he was just a big, husky man. And he was quite a football player on the Frankfurt High School football team. And his brother Ensley was too, and Ensley was even a better athlete than he was. In fact, later on he went on and played for the Chicago Bears. My father didn't do that. But let's see, what was I going to tell you about that? Now, what was I?
The mortuary.
I'm sorry?
The mortuary.
Oh, the mortuary, yes. Well, my father, when he was in high school, there was this very pretty girl he wanted to take to a dance in Thompsonville. My father was one of the very first boys to have a car in high school. He always had a car. And but Alice, her name was Alice, and she had a bad cold. She told me the story before she died. She said, I had a bad cold, but your dad really wanted to take me to this dance in Thompsonville. So he came over to our house to plead his case. And he said to my parents, my father's a doctor, my mother's a nurse, and my brother's studying to be an undertaker. So she'll be well taken care of, but I think it was that part about the undertaker that made them say, no, she couldn't go to the dance in Thompsonville for sure. So, anyway, that's just another family anecdote, which is true.
What was your most memorable experience in college?
My best what?
Oh, I'm going to move on and ask you a few questions about college. What was your most memorable experience in college?
In college? Oh my goodness. There were a lot of them. I think probably the winter term that I went to Mexico City College, which is now the University of the Americas. I hadn't had any plan to do this. I just happened to hear about it from some other friends at Michigan State and at Ohio State. There was a professor from Ohio State who had been taking a group of students down to Mexico City College ever since the end of the Second World War. So for about 10 years, because I went the winter term of 1955. And anyway, I don't know, maybe I just had a premonition about something like this coming up, where I could use my electives. I had saved all of my electives, and so I could take whatever I wanted at Mexico City College for a semester or a term. Michigan State was on the quarter system at that time, and so there were about 7 or 8 of us from Michigan State, and a lot from Ohio State. I forget how many, but maybe 40 or so who went that winter term. And a lot of us took a bus. One of my sorority sisters was going to join me there and be my roommate in Mexico City. We were going to be living with a Mexican family. But her parents were going to be in the South or something, so they were going to take her to Mexico City, apparently. And but I took the bus. I took the bus from East Lansing to Columbus, Ohio, and then I got on another bus with all of these students, and I think the bus held 40 students, and there were 41 of us on the bus. And so we had to take turns sitting on a suitcase all the way from Columbus, Ohio to Mexico City. And we drove first from Columbus to New Orleans. And the Sugar Bowl was being played there. And this was, I think we left probably on the 28th. Maybe 27th or 28th of December. And we got to New Orleans, and the Navy was playing. So there were midshipmen all over town. It was a lot of fun. You know, I was 19 years old. It was just a lot of fun. And we stayed in the French Quarter, and we went to Pat O'Brien's, and we did all have you ever been to New Orleans?
Not yet, but my grandfather used to live in Louisiana.
Oh,
so
really?
We have a little bit of history.
Right,
there.
you had a little bit of idea of what it was. Anyway, that was fun. We stayed 2 days in the French Quarter in New Orleans. Then we got back on the bus, one of us on a suitcase again, but we took turns every few hours. And our next stop was San Antonio, Texas. And there we got to visit the Alamo, and we spent a night in San Antonio. And then the next night, we were in Monterrey, Mexico, and it was New Year's Eve. And I had never been any place, hardly out of Michigan before. I'd been to Wisconsin on the Ann Arbor car ferries. Oh, that's something else I have to tell you about. working on the car ferries. I worked on the car ferries 2 summers when I was in college. But anyway, we got to Monterey, and oh my goodness, it was festive New Year's Eve in Mexico, in Monterey. And so that was a lot of fun. And then the next day we arrived in Mexico City on New Year's Day. And then my family came and picked me up, and they were so nice. It was such a nice Mexican family. And they were emerging middle-class people. So, you know, they had a nice house. They had 3 servants. And so here I'd been living in a dorm at Michigan State, and I suddenly had 3 servants waiting on me. And I remember that we paid, let's see, I think our room and board was $10 a week. I think it was $40 a month. But if we wanted our laundry done, that was an extra 50 cents a week. So by all means, we had our laundry done. These maids were waiting on us hand and foot. It wasn't at all like living in a dorm at Michigan State, I have to tell you. So that was a very special time. And the college, which is now called the University of the Americas, and it's no longer in Mexico City. It's in another town. But the college was outside of Mexico City on the highway to Pueblo. And it was in a beautiful setting. And in those days, Mexico City was about the same size as Chicago was then, about 5 million people. And now, you know, it's 25 million or more. I don't know what it is. So there was no smog then. And you could see the mountains, Popocatépetl and Iztaccíhuatl, from any really higher vantage point, and we could see them both from the college terrace. It was just, so I spent all of those electives. I studied Spanish, of course. I had been studying some Spanish at Michigan State. I studied Spanish. I studied Mexican anthropology, Mexican art, Mexican dance. It was so much fun, and the professors were wonderful. And on the weekends, we would either go to the bullfights, which was an exciting experience, or we would take the bus on Friday nights to Acapulco. In those days, Acapulco was a brand new resort, and there were only 2 hotels in Acapulco at that time. And of course now, you know, it's a huge resort, but we would never stay in a hotel. We couldn't afford that. We were just students. So we would rent a room, and, you know, 4 or 5 girls, and we would sleep crosswise in a double bed like this. And there was usually a sink almost falling off the wall, and maybe we'd see a cockroach or 2, but, you know, it didn't matter. We didn't care. We took the night bus, and it's a wonder we survived, because there were no guardrails on the roads, and they were very mountainous, but we survived, and we had a wonderful time. And Mexico City was a great place in those days. The restaurants were good. The ice cream was good. You could take what they called a Pizarro cab along the Paseo de la Reforma, and it was, you just had to pay a peso, which was about 8 cents, no matter how far you were going. It was, I had a wonderful time there. I really did. I loved being at Michigan State, too, and there I worked at the library. I made 85 cents an hour working at the library, which was a pretty good wage in those days. And I could stay out later than, you know, in those days, women had to be in no later than 11 o'clock at night, and on weekends they had to be in at 1. Or I think you were allowed during a quarter, maybe 3, what they called late pers per term, and so then you could stay later if you had some good reason to stay. And by my junior year, I had moved into my sorority house, and that was a nice experience. And I'm still in touch with those of us who are left. You know, when you get into your mid-80s, there are a lot of people who disappear in your lives. And so my Frankfurt High School class was a class of 36. And as far as I know, I think there are 8 of us left. I'm not sure, but I don't know about some people, but I think there are 8 of us left. So, and the same with my college, my sorority especially, I kept in touch with them more than I did with other students. But, and in those days, women were not allowed to wear shorts on campus, and Bermuda shorts came in while I was a student there. And so I had a sorority sister, and she and I decided that we thought we were gonna wear our Bermuda shorts across campus, but we were not allowed to do that. So we wore raincoats over them. And when we got to the football game, we're going to a football game. Actually, they had something also called Bermuda skirts, which were just like a mini skirt, you know, kind of like a mini skirt, but they had a little panty under them, kind of like tennis skirts. And we were spotted by a reporter from Sports Illustrated, and he wanted to take our picture, and then we ended up in the Sports Illustrated magazine, and we were lucky we didn't get prosecuted by Michigan State for wearing shorts on campus, but we didn't.
Do you know what issue?
I don't. I wish I did, but I don't have it. So, anyway, had a lot of fun in college.
That's good. So you mentioned you were part of a sorority. Were you a part of any other clubs or organizations in college?
Oh, yes. I was a part of a lot of different things. I belonged to the ski club. I belonged to the education honorary. I belonged to, oh my goodness, I can't remember all the clubs I belong to now, but I belong to a lot of different organizations. I was social chairman for my dorm when we were there. Well, when I was in the dorm, I did a lot of things. When you're in the Foreign Service, you're both in the Foreign Service in a way, because we have a lot of entertaining to do, American business abroad.
Can we restart?
Oh, sure.
It's okay. Here, I gotta do it too.
Yeah. Our job was to promote American business abroad, and you know, it was a Sell America job. So, especially, well, everywhere we were was special. Nigeria was our first assignment at the U.S. Embassy in Nigeria. And Tom Pickering, you might have heard of Tom Pickering because he later became ambassador to the United Nations, and he's been ambassador to a lot of other countries as well. He's still living, and in fact he came, I don't know if you've ever heard them talk about the foreign, they have foreign speakers who come and talk on foreign affairs in Traverse City. Have you heard about that?
Yeah.
Well, Tom Pickering came, I guess it was a year ago, last fall or winter, and so we hadn't seen him since Nigeria, but it was fun to touch base with him when he came to speak. And our son-in-law, we have a daughter and son-in-law who live just down the road here, Liz and Stan, and Stan was with the State Department, and that's how our daughter met him, because she had just graduated from the University of Wisconsin, and she went to work for a computer firm, and then the computer firm went bankrupt, so she came out to Lagos, Nigeria, just to visit us, and she ended up getting a job at the embassy. And while she was there, Stan arrived as a new Foreign Service officer, and that's how they met. He's from Iowa, like my husband, but they met in Nigeria, and then he's retired now, and they live in an old family property just a half a mile from here. They have a Victorian house this property belonged to my grandmother LaRue's sister and brother-in-law, and it had been passed down in the family to their daughters, their children, and then our daughter and son-in-law bought it from them when they were elderly, and they rent the Victorian house, and they built a beautiful Japanese house in the barn, in the Norwegian barn. The barn looks like a Norwegian barn outside, but inside it is a beautiful Japanese house with rice paper sliding doors, and they have an ofuru, a Japanese hot tub. They lived in Japan for a number of years when they were in the diplomatic corps, so they bought a lot of things there to furnish the house with. So they have a Japanese house barn. And so anyway, she met Stan in Nigeria at the U.S. Embassy there. Then after they were married, they went to Germany. They served first in Bonn when it was still the capital of West Germany, and then they served in Berlin. And now we have a son and daughter-in-law and 2 grandchildren living in Berlin, and they have a totally different career. Our son is a filmmaker, and our daughter-in-law is a professional dancer.
And I think I found your phone.
What?
I think I found your phone.
Oh.
It's vibrating.
My phone?
I can find it.
You have much better hearing than I do. Oh, here it is. It's right here.
I knew it was close by.
Yeah, you're right. Somebody did just try to call me. You're right. Doesn't look like anybody I know. Thank you. All right.
What was your family life like after college?
What does my family look like?
What was your family life like? Like, how many children did you have?
We have 3 children. I've just told you about my daughter, Liz. We have another daughter, Christina, and she lives in Madison, Wisconsin. She's not married. She's been working for the senior center there for many years, but this past year, the senior center's been closed, so it's been a tough year for her. And she was born in Paris. She was born the year after we went to Paris, and she was born in 1962, December of 1962. And both of our girls were had a lot of French education. Chris went to, by the time she was old enough to go to nursery school, we were living in Lausanne, Switzerland, and she went to a Swiss nursery school. And our daughter Liz, who's about 4 years older, not quite 4 years older, went to a Commonwealth American school, which was run by the British. And one of the wonderful things about going to school in Switzerland is that during the winter, every Friday you go to the mountains to go skiing. So, are you a skier?
No, I'm not. Maybe cross country, but definitely not mountains.
Actually, I used to do quite a lot of downhill skiing right here in Alberta at Alberta Mountain. And then when I was in college, I belonged to the ski club, and we'd go to Cabernet or up to Boyne Mountain. And then, of course, when we lived in Switzerland, it was wonderful. We lived along the shores of Lake Geneva, which is called Lac Léman in French. And but we had palm trees growing out along the lake, but you could be at a wonderful ski resort in 45 minutes. So we really enjoyed our skiing time there. And all right, so that's our second daughter, and then our son was was born when we went back to New York and lived in, I told you we had a house that was built in 1803, and it was a wonderful place. And he was born there, and he is married to Megumi, who is Japanese, and he actually met her in London. He was living and working in London before he came back to the States with her. She has had an international dance career. I mean, she's quite well known. She's had her picture in the New Yorker a number of times. She's really kind of an iconic dancer, and she's still dancing. She was born, she's 46 now, but she's still dancing. And when she was 15, I think, her parents, she's from Nagano, where the Olympics were held in 1998, the Winter Olympics. It's a beautiful place. And her father is a professor. He teaches, he taught in boys' schools for many years. Now he's the superintendent of schools in Nagano now. And her mother also is a ballerina, and she has taught dance for many years, and she had an aunt who was a famous ballerina in Japan. Megumi went to Lausanne to, I don't know if you've ever heard of the Prix de Lausanne, but it's an international competition for young dancers, and she won the Prix de Lausanne. Well, I think there's more than one that wins it, but she won one of the top prizes there at the age of 15. So she didn't finish high school at that time. She was offered a job dancing with the Hamburg, Germany Ballet Company. So she danced with them for several years, and then the National Ballet Company of the Netherlands, of Holland, which is located in Amsterdam, invited her to go and dance there. So she did classical ballet for quite a number of years. And then she decided that she wanted to go to modern dance. So she went with the Rambo Dance Company in London. And they danced at the Sadler's Wells Theater. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. I don't know if you know.
I've heard of the Rambo Dance Company,
Have you?
though.
Oh, okay. Well, she danced with them. And then Carol Armitage she used to dance in New York. She was called the punk ballerina, but she also worked a lot with Balanchine, with George Balanchine, who, you know, did a lot of work with the New York City Ballet. And so Carol started her own company, and she wanted Megumi to be her prime dancer, her premier dancer. So Megumi's been working with Carol now since, 2003, I think. It's 18 years now. And the first performance she gave in New York in 2004 with Carol's company, she won the top dance award of New York City, and everybody had said, oh, New York is a tough place to break into, but Megumi didn't have any trouble at all. And she's danced everywhere. She's danced in South America, she's danced in Russia, she's danced in Italy, she's danced all over the world. And she's really an interesting person, I have to say. Now she's doing a lot of, this past year with COVID, because everything has been closed, she's been teaching online. And she also, the other thing that she does is, because she speaks Japanese and English, of course, and German, but she's been working for a Japanese fish company in New York City that supplies the restaurants in New York City. And this is a job she can do from Berlin early in the morning before anybody's up, because they have to get the restaurants supplied, at night for the restaurants in New York. So that's the other job she has. And she also does a lot of filming with our son. He made a full-length movie last year in Spain, and he's been editing it, and of course the film festivals were all closed, so this year he's hoping he can get it into some film festivals, and so that's what he does. And we have 3 grandchildren. Nicholas just turned 29, and he works for Google in New York City, but right now he can work anywhere. So he was here for a couple of months over the holidays. He was here last summer with his girlfriend. Now he's out in Montana with his girlfriend. She works for an organization in Washington, D.C. called Hidden Brain. I don't know if you've heard of it.
I don't think I have.
But anyway, she works for Hidden Brain. And she was working for NPR, but then she went with Hidden Brain. But she can work from home too. So they're both out in Montana right now, working for Google and Hidden Brain. And Nicholas went to the university. He graduated from the University of Michigan. He went to high school in Berlin, and he went to junior high in Bern, Switzerland. He went to grade school in France, in Paris, and in Washington, D.C., and where else were they during that time? I forget. So he's had quite an interesting life already, too, and he's done a lot of traveling. And then we have 2 Eurasian grandchildren, Noah, who's 13, and he goes to international school in Berlin, as does our granddaughter, Mona, who's 10. And right now they're doing virtual because of the pandemic, but Noah's quite a chess player, and he's won a lot of tournaments. And we play bridge. I don't know if you have ever played bridge.
I haven't, but only because they don't want me to get in on the fun. In my family, it's more of tradition for adults to play card games or play bridge, especially with when they get older. Some of the more my mom's boss, he plays bridge with all his fancy friends and his wife, and he's I think he's maybe early 90s now.
Okay.
So yeah.
What does your mom do?
She's an accountant.
Okay.
For Lobdell Enterprises in Traverse City.
Which company?
Lobdell Enterprises in Traverse City.
Okay.
Yeah, the Lobdell.
And your dad, what does he do?
He's a truck driver for oil companies.
Oh, okay.
So he just went down to Oklahoma because of the whole Texas thing.
It's cold down there.
Yeah, they need engines fast because they're not working well. So
I was just, in fact, I have some cousins in Oklahoma City, and I was on the internet with them yesterday, and it's really cold there. And we have some other cousins in San Antonio and some in Houston, and it's just terrible. They were without power for 3 days, and it's really no water and no heat for 3 days.
Yeah, I was reading about this one mayor in Texas. He basically told everybody to just deal with it on their own, and they still don't have power and water down there.
No, it's terrible.
I know.
It's a terrible thing. Anyway, Noah has been learning to play bridge since he was 9, and he's getting to be quite a good bridge player. And we play online with them. We play usually every weekend, or we try to play on the weekends with Dan and our son and Noah. And we're hoping Mona will learn now too, because she's old. Noah started when he was 9, and she's 10, so we hope she'll be interested. She's very interested in dance as well, and she's a good dancer already. Her mom has taught her well, and anyway, they're interesting kids. They're nice kids, and but we haven't been able to hug them for a long time now. We haven't been able to see them since a year ago, last October. So
Yeah.
we're really sad about that.
That's not fun at all.
Yeah.
So, what are your hopes and dreams for Benzie County in the future?
My hopes and dreams for Benzie County in the future. I just hope it doesn't become much more overrun by tourists. Let me say that. I'd like it to kind of stay the way it is, not get any. I don't want to see more fast food franchises come. Maybe we do need another one or two more traffic lights, but I don't like to. I would like to see the small businesses be able to continue to thrive in this county. And one thing I do think, and I know that there's a lot of opposition to this, but I think it wouldn't be a bad thing if Frankfurt, Alberta, and Benzie Central combined. I think they could offer a lot more to the kids if they did. But that probably isn't going to happen because of the rivalry. But I do feel
And the long bus rides.
Right. I think this is a pretty nice place to live. We usually go away for the winter, but this winter, of course, we didn't go. We like to go away for the winter. We're as I said, my husband will be 90 in April, and we don't enjoy the winter very much anymore.
Yeah.
But we've been going to the island of Grenada for the last few years, and like it. We have a nice bridge club there, and it's a beautiful place, and the people are so nice. And we usually, for years and years, we never missed a year getting back to Paris. In fact, last time we were there was 2 years ago, just before Notre Dame burned. We were in fact staying with a friend who had a view of Notre Dame from her apartment, and what a terrible thing that was. It was just we heard about it on our way home. We were in the O'Hare Airport in Chicago on our way home the day that it burned. It was terrible. So anyway, that was...
I can't believe that was 2 years ago. I feel like that was last year that I was looking at my phone watching that.
Yeah, it was 2 years ago. And of course, you know, we lived in Paris off and on since 1962.
Mm-hmm.
So Paris has been kind of like a second home for us. It's we lived there 2 years then, 5 years in the 70s, again in 81, and then almost every year, no matter where we were since then, we've been back and spent time. And our daughter and son-in-law, who live out here now, have spent a lot of time living in Paris too, so we would go and stay with them. And we had so many wonderful friends in Paris, French friends, and almost all of them are gone now. We have still a couple of women are still living, but we had maybe 20 couples of French friends that were just wonderful, and we had keys to houses and apartments all over France. People just give us a key to their beautiful place on the Mediterranean or their beautiful country house outside of Paris, or that was a wonderful part of our lives. And the time that we lived in Saratoga County, New York, was another wonderful time of our lives. We had so many, we were young then, and we had so many very special friends. We bought this old house, which everybody knew about, of course, that old house forever and ever. There were lots of wonderful, old, beautiful colonial houses there. And we bought it in October, and at Halloween time, we put all our lights on, and and people, all the neighbors came and trick-or-treating with their kids and introduced themselves. And from that time on, we just had a host of friends for all the years we lived there. It was wonderful. They were either professors at Union College, which is where Jimmy Carter went, by the way, or they worked for General Electric, which was Schenectady is nearby, and that's where General Electric was founded. So it was really an interesting group of people. So.
Is there anything we haven't talked about yet that you thought we would?
Anything we haven't talked about? Well, there are a lot of things we haven't talked about, but of course, I think we've talked about quite a bit. So.
Do you have any questions for me or the Remembering Benzie project?
For remembering what?
For the Remembering Benzie project, or for me?
Oh, for you. Yeah, I did. I picked out. I don't know what I did with it now. I had. Oh, I know. This was in the paper, I think, last year, and so you probably knew some of these kids, and but I. So how is it? How are you chosen, or do you volunteer, or?
It was chosen and volunteer this year. Last year it was more like a selective process.
I see.
But this year, because we were online and there was so much going on, a lot of kids didn't know about it. Mm-hmm. And so I was like one of the first people to be like, hey, I want to do this. And they were like, okay, you're in. And I'm like, great.
And what gave you the interest in doing something like this?
It's right up my alley. There's nothing else in this world that could be right up my alley.
Really?
So, yeah, I mean, like, this much as this is, like, I'm a huge history buff. I love this town. I love where I live. Growing up in Lake Ann, I thought I lived in the most beautiful place on earth.
How long have you been all your life in Lake Ann?
And I've gone all over America. I haven't left the country yet, but technically I could, because my parents want me to go to Hawaii. Which is technically leaving the country-ish. Oh. The main country.
The mainland.
So, yeah, I always just thought, I live in the
Have
most
you got some
place.
interest in living abroad?
Yeah, I want to live in Spain someday.
Where?
Spain.
Spain.
That's been, like, the number one.
Are you studying Spanish?
Yeah, I took a semester of Spanish 3 last semester.
What is French must be offered also in Benzie Central, is it?
Yeah, but only online. They used to have a French teacher, but she quit.
Oh.
Yeah.
So, any other languages?
They're all online. I think Latin's online.
Latin you can take online?
They offer Mandarin online.
Really?
Yeah. But we only have Spanish in class. And
I studied some Mandarin.
Yeah.
When I was in
Taipei.
Hard. It's a very difficult language. But I was able to go to the market and pick up, food, and I was able to take the bus and ask where the bathroom was, and but but actually French is
way
the language
harder.
of all our family now, so it's that's what we but anyway,
I know French is difficult as well.
Well, I certainly recommend living abroad. I think it's a wonderful way to learn about other peoples and other cultures.
Yeah.
And we've been fortunate to live in so many different cultures and have the opportunity to, to get to know so many different peoples. We have something I haven't talked to you about, and I don't want to keep you, but we have a Chinese family also. when we were living in Paris. Do you want to go?
No, it's fine.
When we were living in Paris in the 1970s, it was at the time that the Khmer Rouge were taking over Cambodia. And we had, our son was just a little boy then. And he was going to nursery school in Paris. He was going to the United Nations Nursery School in Paris. And then he went to the International School of Paris after that. And our girls went to the French lycée, so they all, spent a lot of time going to school in Paris. But we needed an au pair. Do you know what an au pair is? It's
No.
like a mother's helper. And a lot of times au pairs will come from other countries in Europe or something, young girls who want to learn the language and spend some time in wherever. Paris was the place we were at that time. And they study, and then they work part-time for a family in exchange for room and board and maybe a small bit of pay, so we looked for an au pair for our son Nathaniel's his name, but he was called Fanny then, but he's Than now. And my husband's secretary put a notice up. It was some religious school, I forget, Institut Catholique, I think, and the very first person who appeared was Anna Engay, and she was a 19-year-old girl who was a refugee from Cambodia, and she was working already as an au pair for another family, but she was also studying. So she didn't come to live with us, but she came to help us every day, or 5 days a week or something, I forget exactly what. Anna is still a very good friend of ours. Every time we go to Paris, we see her. Her son is kind of like another son of ours, and he's been here with his family to visit us. But anyway, after Anna couldn't work with us anymore, she's Chinese, but her parents escaped from China at the time that Mao came to power and went to Vietnam. Then, of course, the Indonesian war there, the Indo-Chinese war there came, and they escaped to Cambodia with their family. And then, of course, the Khmer Rouge came.
They just have bad luck.
So her parents did escape to Paris, but then they went back, and they were never heard from again. It was really sad. They went back because they had some family there, and they. So then, anyway, Anna couldn't work for us anymore because her studies were taking too much of her time, and she had this other job. So she sent us a cousin who had just arrived from Cambodia as a refugee, and she worked for us for a while. And then when she couldn't work for us anymore, she sent us a sister who had just arrived from Cambodia, and we discovered that she and her two sisters and brother were all living in this tiny little maid's room in Paris, and we had a big house, and that we had found by luck in Paris. It was a wonderful house. It had 6 bedrooms and 7 fireplaces.
That's a
right
big
in the
house.
middle of Auteuil in Paris. It was, and we were paying less than we'd paid for a tiny little apartment. So we invited Naren and Soti to come and live with us, her brother, and Soti and Naren lived with us. Well, they have become just like our own children. Naren and her husband were here last year. When we go to Paris, we're just, we see a lot of them. All of them are very successful. They've just, the Chinese are Orientals are very ambitious people, and they've all been very successful. They were refugees. They came with nothing, but when we go to Paris, because we helped them some. We helped them, their parents, get to the head of the line. Naren and Soti's parents, because Anna's were lost, but we helped them get to the head of the line. They left Phnom Penh on the day that the Khmer Rouge came, on the 18th of April in 1975. They spent all summer walking from Phnom Penh to Saigon, subsisting on fruits and berries and nuts in the forests, hiding from the Khmer Rouge, going across the river to Vietnam on the dark of the moon in a rowboat that they found on the shore. I mean, it's an incredible story, just an incredible story. And they got to Saigon, and we finally heard from them. We didn't know all summer whether they were alive or not. And anyway, I won't bore you with this, but they're our family too. We have a Chinese family in Paris.
You have a massive family all over the world. What are you talking about?
Yeah.